Hello everyone. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about the pericardium. Before we talk specifically about the pericardium, let's see where the heart is located within our thoracic cavity. It will sit anteriorly within the chest wall. This means that it is in front of other structures like the esophagus and the aorta that will run behind it, as we can see from this image. We can also add that it is located directly posterior to the sternum, where it will sit inside of the pericardial cavity. Here is the sternum, which is your breastbone, and here's the pericardial cavity, which is a portion of the ventral body cavity, as we can see from this image. And this is when you know that everything that you learn is interconnected. Remember from A&P1? The pericardial cavity is this component that contains the heart, and this pericardial cavity is going to be situated between the pleural cavities, which are the compartments that house the lungs. And the pericardial cavity is also located inside another cavity, which is called the mediastinal cavity or the mediastinum. Taking a closer look at the mediastinum, it is the space in the thoracic cavity between the pleural cavities that will hold the lungs. We can see it highlighted here in yellow. And the mediastinum will hold the heart inside of its own cavity within the mediastinum, which is the pericardial cavity. In addition to the heart, we will also find other important structures inside of the mediastinum, which are the thymus, which is anterior to the heart and is part of the lymphatic system. Posteriorly to the heart, as we can see on this image, we find the trachea, which is part of the respiratory system, and the esophagus, which is part of the digestive system. And on these lab models, the image to the left still has the heart, but the image to the right, as you can see, I have removed the heart. Therefore, posterior to the heart, we can see the trachea and the esophagus as well. Now, these models, they don't have the thymus, which would be located anterior to the heart. And here is where it would sit. Lastly, we're going to cover the pericardium, which is a membrane of connective tissue that surrounds the heart and also the pericardial cavity. And this membrane is a continuous sheet that will be composed of two parts, the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium has this very tough, irregular connective tissue, and this connective tissue is going to be important because it will provide the support to the heart. And how does it do this? Well, it will attach to the diaphragm, for example, as we can see here on this image, forming this fibrous attachment. And by doing this, it prevents the heart from moving everywhere when it beats, especially when you're doing a rigorous exercise. Think about how fast your heart is beating. If it did not have this fibrous support, it would be bouncing everywhere, and this could even cause damage to the heart wall. In addition to its attachment to the diaphragm, the fibrous pericardium also attaches to the sternum and the vertebral column. And all these attachments, they will guarantee that the heart stays stable where it belongs, even when it is beating so fast that it is trying to jump out of your chest. Next, let's talk about the serous pericardium. This one will lie deep to the fibrous pericardium, and it will be composed of two layers, the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. To visualize the relationship between the heart and the pericardial cavity, imagine that you're pushing your fist toward the center of a large balloon as depicted in this image over here. The wall of the balloon will correspond to the pericardium, and your fist is the heart. This means that this outer layer of the balloon will correspond to the parietal pericardium, and the inner layer will correspond to the visceral pericardium. And in the middle of the balloon, there's a space that's filled with air, right? And this air-filled space will correspond to the pericardial cavity. The parietal pericardium where the word parietal means wall of a cavity or hollow organ, will be the layer right after the fibrous pericardium. Therefore, it is the outer layer of the serous pericardium. It is important to note that there is no space between the fibrous pericardium and the parietal pericardium, as the parietal pericardium is going to be firmly attached to the fibrous pericardium. It will surround the heart and the roots of the great blood vessels. The great blood vessels are the large arteries and veins that are going to be directly connected with the heart. Therefore, these are going to be the pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, and the aorta, which we have already talked about them, and the two major veins that bring carbon dioxide-rich blood from the systemic circuit into the heart, emptying it into the right atrium. And these two veins are called the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, as we can see them here on this image. The visceral pericardium is going to be the most inner layer of the serous pericardium that will be intimately in contact with the viscera. The word viscera means organ. So what is going to be the viscera that we are talking about? In this case, it is the heart. In fact, it is so intimately associated with the heart that it will form the outer layer of the heart muscle itself, and therefore it can be also called the epicardium, where epi means above, therefore the top layer of the heart. We will be able to see this in more details on the next learning outcome of this module. But before we move on, let me not forget to talk about the pericardial cavity, which was the space represented in the balloon. So this space is actually going to be a space that's going to be filled with a fluid that's known as the pericardial fluid. And there is about 10 to 20 milliliters of the fluid inside the space. And this fluid is going to be secreted by the cells that form the membrane of the serous pericardium. Now, this fluid will act as a lubricant in that it will be able to reduce the friction of the beating heart inside of the pericardial cavity. As we can imagine, it is important to protect the heart. Therefore, the fluid, which is called pericardial fluid, together with the cavity that the heart sits in, together with the fibrous attachment that's formed by the fibrous pericardium attaching to the diaphragm, all this is important to support the heart and protect the heart while it's doing its function.